At any rate, life happens. Okay, that was weird. Okay, so it looks like it's doing the recording. You all kind of faded to black there for a second, but um, okay. So backing up a little bit, we talked a little bit extra about web tracking. So what I'm going to talk about today is this RESTful architecture. And in particular, what I want to talk about is using APIs and using Ajax. So the architecture piece I'm going to zip through pretty quickly um, because the REST or RESTful architecture is exactly what we've been using all along. What this says in a nutshell is that the things that we've been using, things like stateless interfaces, uniform interfaces, layered systems, okay, are all part of a RESTful architecture. Okay, what it what it allows you to do is not decompile, unlink the client side from the server side, so that you can work with these two sides independently. Okay, and that's one of the critical components. What is that word? Well, anyway, just feel free to interrupt if you can think of that word, or B, if you can decouple. That's what I'm thinking of. Decouple the client from the server interface. Okay, or if you have any questions. Okay, the other part of this architecture that's important is that it's always dealing with resources. Okay, so remember when we are retrieving um, things from websites, okay, we're retrieving one resource after another using typically either a get or a post command. Okay, so all of these resource calls or resource retrievals, okay, are an important part of the architecture. And a resource can be a web page, a JavaScript script, it can be a CSS file, it can be a image, a video, whatever I need to build the page is a resource. Okay. Okay. All right, so kind of moving ahead with that mindset. Okay, we're going to think about um, a way to retrieve these resources in real time. Okay, so everything we've done up until this point has been loading a page all at once. So all the CSS, the JavaScript, the HTML, even though it might run at different times depending on what we click on or how we tab into fields, okay, it was all loaded when the page loaded. Okay, now we're going to recognize that that doesn't always have to be the case. Okay, we can actually load parts of our website on demand or after the page has loaded or while the page is loading. Okay, this is incredibly useful. Okay, you can imagine, if you have a million records, you don't want to sit there and wait for all of those million records to be retrieved and parsed before the page appears. Okay. Other times, the things we retrieve may depend on something the user enters. Okay, so we may want to wait until the user gives us a search term or picks an item from our shopping page, okay, before we retrieve data about that item. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. The mechanism for doing that is called Ajax. It's a little bit of an older term, but the asynchronous part still matters. It's asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Okay, XML is another type of markup language like HTML, and I have no doubt that it would, in fact, work with that, but we're mostly going to return JSON, okay, instead of XML, okay, as part of this. Okay, so as I go through this, I'm going to skip back and forth. Okay, I'm actually first going to go through the code. Okay, and then I'm going to jump back to this image. Okay, and then I'm going to finally jump back to the step-by-step, which seems a little backwards, but I think having it explained in this way makes more sense versus the written. And I'm going to do it in the compiler here, or in Sublime, just to get the better contrast. Okay, this is exactly the same code, I think, that's on the website. There's always the risk that I've changed it somehow. Okay. Okay, so this is a very simple web page. I'll bring it up just so you can see it. Okay, it's an HTML web. So I did change it. Hang on a second. I added an onload function, which I'm going to remove temporarily. Okay. Okay, so it's strictly an HTML page. It's not a Python script or anything like that. Okay, so it's technically using the Bootstrap template, but it's not using like any of the fancy stuff. Okay, it has a single button on the page. And when somebody clicks the button click handler function runs. Okay, we know how this works, how an on-click event happens. Okay, and it has a single container, okay, with a heading 1 of employee list, and then an unordered list with no items in them. Okay, so you can see we've got our button and our employee list. Okay, and just to show you how it works dynamically, when I click fetch data, okay, the list is then populated. Okay, so let's see how that works, okay, kind of one stage at a time. Oops, why do I keep doing that? Okay. All right, so, okay, so we saw the on-click event called this button click handler. Okay, so when I click the button, this is the function that runs. Okay, we're pretty comfortable with this idea of how JavaScript and HTML interact at this point. Okay, the first thing that happens within this function is I create this new XML HTTP request. Okay, this is a class in Python. I'm sorry, in JavaScript. Okay, and I'm creating a new object of that type. Okay, it's very common to call this object XHR, but keep in mind that this is just a local variable. I could call that anything I wanted to. Okay, now I'm going to use the open method of this object, okay, to set up a request. Okay, so this part here is just setting up the request. I'm doing a get, okay, one of these get types of requests. Okay, this is the URL I'm going to call, okay, when I do that get. Okay, and I'm going to give it a third parameter of true, which just means do it asynchronously. Okay, the third parameter is almost always true because the whole point of this is to do it asynchronously. Okay. Okay, so here's the tricky part. Okay, this whole section, okay, is setting the onload variable, okay, of XHR to be equal to this function. Okay, so this is one of these cool JavaScript things where I can I can set a variable equal to a function, which is kind of unique to JavaScript. I can't usually do that. Okay, so this is the function that will be called, okay, on load. Okay, but what's important about this is that this function, or this statement here, is defining the function but not yet running it. Okay, so that's really important. This command defines the function, sets it all up, but does not execute the function. Okay, this function does not get executed until we execute the send command, okay, which does the actual get of this website. Okay, so when we execute that send command, okay, and the data comes back, the data starts loading, okay, then I'm going to execute the onload, okay, function. Okay, so kind of unintuitive compared to what we're used to doing, where we're used to seeing, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Okay, what we're doing is step 1, step 2, set up step 4, step 3, and then execute step 4. Okay, that's how this process works. Okay, this function is called a callback function. It's not an unusual concept, okay, but it is pretty new to you. It isn't something you've done in other courses. Okay, so you're setting up a function that'll be called later. Okay, so let's go back through the image. That's all there is to the code itself. Okay, so again, I start with my HTML page. It loads. Okay. At that point, I have, okay, this website, no list yet. Okay. When I click the button, okay, something happens. Okay, so the function do something is called. It creates this object. It sets up some parameters. It defines the onload function, and it sends a message. Okay, at that point, when the send happens, okay, that request goes to the server. The server responds. Only then does the onload function run and the website gets updated. Okay. Inside this function, okay, all I'm doing is I'm getting the response.text, which comes back as a string. I'm parsing that to get it back into a JSON object or JavaScript object. Okay. I'm getting my list item from my HTML page. We've done that a million times now. Okay, and then I'm looping through, okay, this object, okay, and basically extracting the employee name. Okay, so let me show you what this API looks like. This API seems like this big magical thing. Okay, so this is the API that I'm calling. Okay. It is nothing exciting at all. It's just a giant JavaScript object. Okay. It has two elements at the highest level. It's got something called status and something called data. Okay. The data element is actually a list, okay, of elements. Okay. Each element in the list, let me grab this here. Okay, is itself a JavaScript object. Okay, so I have a dictionary, okay, with two elements. The data element of that dictionary is a list, like a Python list of dictionaries. So, converting my notation into Python, I've got a dictionary that contains a list of dictionaries, okay, as one of its elements. I'm going to take a breath and pause for questions at this point.
Ma'am, could you say that one more time? So it's a JSON object that contains multiple JSON objects.
Correct. So this is one giant. This whole thing is a JSON object. It starts and ends with the squigglies. Okay. The outer JSON object has two elements, status, which is just a string, and data, which is actually a list. Okay, so this is the data element of that outside one. Okay, within the data element, each element of that list or array in JavaScript terms is itself another dictionary, okay, or JavaScript object, depending on which language you want to think about it in. Okay, so when I'm parsing that, okay, the first thing I'm doing is I'm converting it to a JavaScript object. Then I'm pulling out the data. Okay, so I'm pulling this element, data, oops. Okay. Then I'm looping through, okay, the data. And for each object in the data, I'm pulling out the employee name, basically. Okay, so when I click this, okay, nothing happens. Why did nothing happen? Because I probably created an, oh, see that delay there? Okay, that delay was the asynchronous part of it. Okay, that server was busy. It took a few seconds to come back, or, I've got, video and recording and everything going on my end. So it took a few seconds to come back. Okay, that's the asynchronous nature of the process.
So this could probably be accomplished without the API. You could make like a big JSON object in like JavaScript. This is just probably more practical if we have more data values.
Okay, right, exactly, Austin. So I'm relying, here on the fact that somebody else is keeping track of this list. Okay, and I don't want to keep it hard coded in my JavaScript. Okay, maybe this list is being generated from a database or a flat file on the server end. And in fact, that's where we're going to go to next with the lecture once everybody feels comfortable or there's any other questions. So this, in fact, isn't even on my local host. Okay, I didn't create this API. Somebody else created it, and I'm just using it. Okay. Okay, so you can see here all of the stuff that my host is responding to is the stuff I call. So when I do, let's keep this guy open. Let me refresh here. Okay, so I'm going to keep this screen open. I'm going to squish this over so you can see it all. Okay. So if I refresh here, you see another line get added. But when I click fetch data, nothing changed here because this REST API example.com server was the one that responded to that request. Okay, my local host server did not have to respond to that request. Everybody comfortable so far? Other questions? Okay. All right, I'm actually going to stop this recording and save it. Hang on.